have a bit of a weird history with Sonic games. I originally played Sonic Rush and Rush Adventure on the DS as a kid, but was never good enough to beat them despite having fun. Then I played a bit of Sonic Colors for the Wii but never finished it for whatever reason. Now just a couple years ago I played Sonic Mania, which I did manage to finish, and I was immediately impressed by it. This changed my perspective on Sonic games from initially thinking that they just weren't for me, to now realizing that it was actually a skill issue. So I decided to confirm this for myself by going back to the start of the series with the original Sonic the Hedgehog for the Sega Genesis, but actually played on the Sonic Origins collection. So let's talk about the blue bloke himself and his debut title. I'm going to speed through this game's visual presentation since it's about the same as I've said for many other older games. The sprites all look great, the foreground is distinct from the background so it's always clear what will damage you, and Sonic is so well animated. His leg spinning when you're going fast really adds to his personality. I'd say his sprite work peaks in Sonic Mania, but for the first game I'm impressed with how he looks. And for the real showstopper, this game's music. For context, I consider the soundtrack of Sonic Mania to be within my top favorite video game soundtracks of all time, paired up with the likes of Celeste, Blinks the Time Sweeper, Destiny, and others. I think the first Sonic's music is decent overall, is what I originally planned to say. I remember not liking many of the songs since I was so stressed out during my first playthrough that I couldn't focus on them, but after going back to listen to them on YouTube, damn. Obviously the Green Hill Zone music is iconic and has been remixed a million times in the series, but every Zone song is a banger. They all have such high energy and you could head bob to any of them. I think my personal favorite is the Spring Yard Zone music. It's simply unmatched with its spunk and immaculate vibes. Even the shit zones have good music, which makes them slightly more tolerable. I'll talk about the gameplay of these levels soon, but for now I can say that this soundtrack is great from start to end. These games are all about momentum, and not this momentum, or even this momentum, but more specifically about getting into a rhythm and maintaining quick movement. Sonic doesn't automatically reach top speed. He needs a surprisingly long running start before he really gets moving. This can of course be achieved faster by using the spin dash or running downhill, but these options aren't always safe or available to you. So if you're stationary in front of an enemy or a large pit, you typically need to give yourself enough space to get up to speed before making the jump. Despite one of the selling points of Sonic as a character being speed, it can often be a bad idea to move fast since it gives you less time to react to the obstacles in front of you. One of the hardest pills to swallow when getting into the Sonic series is that you can't always just run at max speed all the time and expect success. Taking any kind of damage will completely kill all momentum in the most non-physical way possible and send you into a knockback state. You have no control over your knockback, with always being launched at a specific angle until you touch solid ground again, meaning that if you take damage near a pit then you're cooked. If you're new to the Sonic series like I am, this will undoubtedly get you killed more than a few times. There's really nothing like being on a good run and colliding with one enemy out of nowhere that sends you into an insta-kill hazard, truly the pinnacle of gaming. When first playing these games, I was having much more fun just going fast and trying to react on the fly, but I eventually realized that you can't feasibly beat the game that way. You need to teach yourself when to slow down and deal with whatever's in front of you, whether that be an enemy, tight jumps, or an obstacle meant to kill you like an annoyingly placed spring. Accepting this fact has allowed me to enjoy the gameplay of Sonic much more than when I was a child, and I now see these games as platformers that had the speed sections thrown in as a bonus. Many Sonic games follow a similar structure of being divided into zones with 3 acts in each. Usually these zones have unique and creative names that encapsulate their core themes. For Sonic 1, these zones include Green Hill Zone, Marble Zone, Spring Yard Zone, Labyrinth Zone, Starlight Zone, and Scrap Brain Zone. I'll be talking about the theming and mechanics featured within each zone, then later ranking each one for how much I enjoy them. But first, these aren't your typical 2D platformer levels like you might see in something like the Mario series. The zones in Sonic use a maze-like structure with several diverging and layered paths that all funnel you towards the end goalpost. There are some levels that are an exception to this core design, such as Marble Zone with its more straightforward paths, but a vast majority of Sonic levels are built in this labyrinthian way. The average act will have a minimum of 2 or 3 main paths along the top, middle, and bottom of the level map, each with unique obstacles and rewards along the way. The stacking of these paths also allow for more dynamic stages, where you may begin along one path and be moved to another without even noticing. For example, just in the first act of the game, there's a more difficult top path to stay on due to its mid-air platforms. Instead of outright dying if you fall off, you'll just land on the path below and continue as usual. This highlights how layers can be stacked without necessarily being built to interact with each other. In levels like Spring Yard Zone, moving between layers is baked into the level traversal. You'll be moving along one path, reach a dead end that forces you upwards, then boom, you're on the other path that's been running adjacent to you this whole time. There generally is one main path that most players will follow along, but the branching level structure and various short offshoots make these games feel like no other 2D platformer. The nature of this design philosophy forces you to both make it to the end of the level and also keep a mental map of the level to avoid getting lost. Because recall that first word I used to describe these, maze-like. It is entirely possible to lose track of where you are in the stage, occurring most often in the late game areas. This is something you will never hear someone say about a 2D Mario level, even in the most recent titles, which I think is really neat. I mean, just look at some of these level maps, especially for the final world. These look worse than my cable management. I seriously cannot follow what's happening in this picture. You could put any of these in a Where's Waldo book and they'd be the hardest pictures by a long shot. I feel obligated to praise the complexity and variety of these levels because it adds so much replayability to this game, with the varied routes you can take through a single level making it feel slightly different in each playthrough. But that's just my thoughts while writing this script at 1 in the morning, because it's entirely different to actually play these stages. So let's switch from general design philosophy to first key level features and later the individual zones that make up the original Sonic the Hedgehog. This game doesn't have a traditional health system that you would expect from a 2D platformer. How Sonic reacts to damage is dependent on your ring counter. If you have 0 rings, then you'll lose a life and be reset to the start of the current act or your last checkpoint. If you have any amount greater than 1, then upon taking a hit you will drop all of them at once. And I really do mean all of them. You can have 50 or even 100 rings saved up, then watch all of them scatter just from stubbing your toe. You can recollect the rings dropped, but they'll start to disappear quickly, so unless you dropped a low number, it's basically impossible to grab them all back. If you can somehow continuously grab at least 1 ring each time you get hit, then you effectively cannot die. But they can fly away so unpredictably that sometimes it's not even worth trying to get that single ring back. You'd be better off focusing on getting to safety and scouring the level for that next set of rings. There are also various power-ups and items scattered throughout the levels that can be collected. Some of these include a 10 ring pickup, temporary invincibility, and a shield that will block your next hit. They're all helpful and I'm glad to see any one of them show up for me to use. I don't really have anything else to say other than that, so yeah, cool feature but nothing game changing. The final act of each zone ends with a boss fight against Dr. Eggman. They're all functionally the same, requiring you to jump into his flying car a certain number of times before being defeated, but they all have a unique twist on that formula to keep them feeling different. These vary from limiting the amount of space you have to walk on to changing the level terrain itself. Especially the final boss, where 2 of the 4 crushers in the room randomly move with Eggman inside one vulnerable to attack. That being said, it's just so damn slow and completely up to chance if you happen to be in the right spot to damage him. It's also where I had to deal with one of my most hated parts of this game, dying from being crushed. I will complain about this more shortly because I have a lot to say when it's more appropriate. Either way, this boss fight was not a great final impression for the game, and seeing that there's technically a better ending than the one that I got was just salt in the wound. I generally consider boss fights in the 2D Sonic series to be one of their weakest aspects, and it looks like they've been fumbling these since day 1 with this game. There's also special stages that are accessible after completing a level with at least 50 rings. You have to navigate Sonic through a rotating maze of bumpers to the end where the Chaos Emerald is located. Due to his perpetual falling and getting constantly ping-ponged around, it's really awkward to try and go anywhere. You can get Sonic to hit special blocks that change the direction of rotation, but otherwise you just have to deal with him occasionally going wherever he wants. And there's fake end goals too that will cause you to fail without any second chances. How wonderful. I do not care for these special stages, and the only reason for even wanting to do them is to unlock the game's secret ending after completing 6 of these stages throughout the game. The bad ending of this game is where after finally beating Dr. Eggman, he still uses the power of the 6 Chaos Emeralds and wins in the end. However, by securing all of these yourself during a playthrough, the good ending is reached where Sonic uses this power to defeat Eggman once and for all, at least until the sequel. I considered replaying the game just for this extra ending, but it doesn't result in more gameplay or an interesting reward, so I didn't bother with it. I'm sure this was a cool discovery for unsuspecting players in 1991, so I think its inclusion is still to be commended. And now, at long last, let's move on to the real discussion I've been looking forward to, talking about the zones themselves. Green Hill Zone is the most standard level you could ask for, with rolling greens, limited pitfalls, easy enemies, and plenty of long stretches to showcase Sonic's speed. But this is far from a bad thing, as this type of level is a perfect introduction for learning the movement and physics of the game. Green Hill Zone reminds me of a school playground, lots of things to do and falling down isn't the end of the world, just get up and keep moving. It's a welcoming level that encourages exploration before the game actually becomes difficult, and is the exact intro this game needed to hook people. It's no surprise that Sega keeps reusing it so often. Marble Zone is the second world, and this is where the stark realization of what this game actually is hits you. Sonic is all about going fast, sometimes. While speed is an important feature of Sonic as a character and series, it's also a platformer. And right in the second level, Marble Zone is much more about tight jumps over lava. There's spike traps littered everywhere, coming out of the floors, walls, and even falling from the ceiling. You even have to push blocks around to give yourself a way to cross a pit of lava, which sounds like a completely different game from what I described earlier. No more open air and grassy fields, now you're going spelunking in a purple hellscape. Seriously, who decided to make this world so purple? What about anything else that would actually resemble a real cave? This level is also where you'll most likely get introduced to what I find to be the most annoying way to die. getting crushed. Being crushed is an instant death, and there's no opportunity to correct it. No rings lost, no bubble shield destroyed. The only thing destroyed is my sanity over how specific this blue bastard's hitbox is. Even if it's a gap that you could comfortably fit in while crouched down, this game just doesn't give a shit and will cook you for even thinking about standing up. This is one thing that legitimately frustrates me while playing, and I will continue to hate it as I see it in future titles. Overall, Marble Zone is an alright level, the least offensive of the two linear worlds. I think the focus on pure platforming is a welcome addition to the core formula, and Sonic controls well enough that it never feels like you need to wrestle with a controller to get anywhere. Springyard Zone brings you right back to the faster paced gameplay of Green Hill Zone, and it's my favorite world in the game. As the name suggests, one of its defining characteristics are springs all over the place. You're constantly rebounding, jumping, and bouncing off of springs like being stuck in a pachinko machine. Some of these large spiked balls moving in circles obliterate me because of the curved walls being impossible to jump off of. Why do they do this? Regardless, the music here is absolutely schlappin' and the visuals really do it for me. I like seeing the mountains in the background and all of the lit up signs around the level. It gives Springyard Zone a unique vibe from the rest of the zones. It's almost like an early concept for a casino world, which we would see in later games. Its design is more open than Marble Zone, but a bit less so than Green Hill Zone, with optional paths functioning more as short side areas rather than new ways to advance through levels. Some of the later acts see more layered paths akin to the first zone, but not to the same degree, which I don't mind. Really good stuff here, if only it could last longer. Labyrinth Zone is one of the strangest inclusions in a Sonic game. If I knew nothing about this game, and you tried convincing me that there was an entire water world, I would think that you're lying. You're telling me a game about a character that's known for going fast has water levels with very slow movement and precision obstacle dodging? Truly a game from the early 90s. Thankfully this zone isn't actually all that bad. Like yes, it still sucks and sluggishly moving through water is never going to be fun, but you do get used to it. Except this isn't like a water level in Mario games. Oh no sir. This is Sonic, and you're stuck walking through it with limited airtime. These acts share the similar gameplay of avoiding obstacles while moving from one air bubble generator to the next without drowning.
In water, chimps will drown.
It reminds me of the slower gameplay of Marble Zone, but now it's even slower. Thank you so much, Sega. Regardless of this, the acts are mostly linear with the occasional offshoot, preventing you from losing track of where you're going. The bubble spawners are also pretty generously spaced out, so you're not bumbling around looking for the next one since they're never too far away from each other. What can be stressful, however, is when the bubbles sometimes just don't want to spawn, so you have to awkwardly wait around for the bubble to appear while your air timer slowly ticks down and that panic-inducing music starts to play. This has killed me before, and it's yet another thing completely out of your control that can result in a death. Just make the bubbles come out more consistently or more often if anything. I hardly think dying because you made it to the next bubble spawner at the wrong time is fair. Starlight Zone is the most forgettable world for me. It has a really bland green color palette, but the starry background and futuristic looking architecture definitely saved it from being visually boring. A core feature of this zone is seesaws that can be used to launch Sonic upwards, which is effectively just a spring with extra steps. Okay, it's an alright inclusion that adds more complexity and planning to the gameplay, but that's really it. However, the bomb enemies in this world are actually bullshit, with their explosions launching several smaller projectiles that are both hard to see and travel through floors and walls for no discernible reason. Also, one look at the level maps shows just how intricately designed the later worlds have become. These levels are more layered than a wedding cake and have more twists and turns in a game of life. There's a good variety of high speed and platforming sections, but some annoying ass enemies keep me from liking it more than other zones. If Green Hill Zone was the elementary school playground, then Scrap Brain Zone is the prison showers, and by god is that soap slippery. As I briefly showed while talking about the level design of this game, this zone has the most maze-like features. Layered on top of this complexity are countless hazards, ranging from columns of fire to electricity and buzzsaws that make this place a nightmare to avoid taking damage. And the bomb enemies are back! I spent most of my time in this zone fighting for my life with just one ring that I kept picking up to avoid getting insta-killed by everything. Despite the pain and suffering from playing through Scrap Brain Zone, its overall factory aesthetic is undoubtedly cool. It really does feel like the final zone, which is something I always love seeing in my video games. I appreciate when the end of a game culminates in a final section or world that actually feels like you're about to face the hardest section of the game, and Scrap Brain Zone does a great job of achieving that. That being said, if you asked me to design a new torture method during the medieval era, it'd have to be playing exclusively Scrap Brain Zone for the rest of your life. And don't even get me started on the surprise at the end of the second act, where Eggman appears just to drop you into the worst part of the game, Scrap Brain Zone Act 3. This level is the peak of bullshit with everything it throws at you, and I do mean literally everything. We've really got it all here. Slow movement, short drowning timers in water, spike traps, opportunities to get crushed, obstacles and enemies that appear out of nowhere, and it's a confusing maze where you can get lost fumbling around looking for air bubbles. I felt my heart sink when I started this third act of a zone that I already wasn't fond of, just to see that there was water.
I'll never forgive the Japanese!
And with all of those zones discussed, it's time to rank them from worst to best. In 6th place, I'm sorry Scrap Brain Zone, but you honestly suck shit, and I kind of hate this part of the game. It would probably be in 5th place if it wasn't for the horrendous third act being the epitome of stupid, but I just cannot ignore how much it brings down the rest of the zone. I wouldn't want to remove it because at this point it feels like a rite of passage beating it, but that doesn't mean I won't take pleasure in being its biggest hater. In 5th place, I don't know who thought water levels were a good idea to put in a Sonic game, but lo and behold we have Labyrinth Zone. It's slow, it's clunky, and it's just dog shit all around. In 4th place, it's going to be Marble Zone. I don't hate this world as much as I might have expressed earlier. It's certainly leagues above Labyrinth and Scrap Brain Zone, but the slower nature and more linear structure leave a bit to be desired. I think Sonic games are at their best when it feels like there's more to explore in a level even after beating it, but with the more linear worlds, I feel like I've seen everything on the first playthrough. Still fun, but not for me. In 3rd place, we have the forgettable but still enjoyable Starlight Zone. I appreciate its return to open-ended design after the water-filled mess of Labyrinth Zone, but it feels lacking in energy and like it's missing something compared to my other personal favorites. In 2nd place, we have the iconic Green Hill Zone. It's a perfect introduction to this game for teaching the controls and getting players accustomed to Sonic's movement. If it had more complexity, it would be at the top spot, but it remains kind of basic in comparison to my favorite zone. Speaking of which, in 1st place it obviously has to be Spring Yard Zone. The music is incredible, and the vibes of bouncing on springs and bumpers just hit different for me. It's not the most mechanically deep or harder stage, but it's the one I have the most fun with on any run. All in all, a somewhat mixed bag of zones that still remain iconic for the series. So if there's any credit I can give this roster of worlds, it'd have to be that. Some people have serious nostalgia for these levels, and I have to give respect to that. It's not entirely to my liking, but I'm hopeful the sequels will continue delivering more interesting level themes and gameplay mechanics. I was pleasantly surprised with my time playing the original Sonic the Hedgehog. Typically games during this era have really outdated design and feel like a chore to play, but I don't feel entirely that way for Sonic. Besides the obvious pain points throughout the game like Labyrinth and some parts of Scrap Brain Zone, I could honestly see myself returning to play this game again in the future. Is it one of my favorite games of all time? Absolutely not. The parts that suck are pretty awful, and the boss fights are not fun at all. However, it did give me a new appreciation for this series, and I'm quite interested in seeing how Sonic 2 and 3 end up being. Unlike other series like Mario and Kirby where their games have only gotten better with time, I'm already in what people consider to be the golden era of 2D Sonic, so I'm going to enjoy it while it lasts. Thank you for watching.